Dear beloved community, it's so wonderful to be sitting together with everybody on this, the 26th of December in the year 2021. A very Merry Christmas to each one of you. Here in Mountain Spring, we've enjoyed a very simple and meaningful Christmas. We lit candles, we enjoyed tea meditation, and we enjoyed each other's presence. For those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, at this time of the year, we're welcoming in the light in the middle of what is the darkest time of the year. Here in Australia, although we celebrate those ancient traditions, it's a little interesting because actually these are the longest days of the year. In the old tradition of the winter solstice in the Northern Hemisphere, we light candles in the midst of the darkness. We're not trying to get rid of the darkness, but to illuminate it from within. The darkness is not an enemy. This is also the basis of our meditation practice. We light the lamp of mindfulness and we shine it in order to illuminate all parts of our mind and our heart and the world around that we don't yet understand, that we don't yet have compassion for. This courage to turn towards our lived experience just as it is where real and embodied insight, the insight that transforms, comes from. I had a visitor come to Mountain Spring a few weeks ago, and as we were drinking tea together, he said to me, "You know, you guys are weird." He was talking about myself and the other monk who was here at the time, Brother Tenzin. "You guys are weird." Most people are running after a higher wage, a bigger car, and so on, and that's their happiness. But for you, you've got none of those things and you're not interested in them. "It actually scares me," is what he said. "But I see that you're so happy, maybe even happier than the people who have all those things." And honestly, I myself am really intrigued by friends who come to the monastery and then at the end of a day of mindfulness or a retreat, they say, "Now back to the real world." The way we choose to live, whether in a monastery or in a household, is a decision. And that decision is both individual and collective. Whether it's real or not, whether it's the real world or not, depends on whether we're conscious about the choices we make in each and every moment, and on the mind frames and the views that we buy into. If we can grasp the Buddha's teaching in the first line of the Dhammapada, mind is the forerunner of everything. Everything depends on the mind. We see that what we call the outer world and what we call the inner world are intimately connected. Touching this is empowering. And this is the kind of insight that doesn't come about through thinking. Honestly, how often has thinking transformed your situation? If anything, we end up more tangled. There's a nice text about this in the Samyutta Nikaya. You can find it in chapter 7 of the Samyutta Nikaya. It's called the Jata Sutta. And another teacher, whose name is Bharavaja, came to visit the Buddha. And in the form of a verse, as it's written in the Jata Sutta, asked the Buddha a question. This teacher says there's an inner tangle and an outer tangle. This generation is entangled in tangle. So I ask you, who is the one who succeeds in untangling the tangle? And the Buddha's answer in the text is a wise person grounded in mindfulness trainings, developing discernment and wisdom. A keen and alert practitioner can untangle both the inner and outer tangle. For those who have transformed greed, ill will, and delusion, The tangles have been untangled. I love the Buddha's response. It's very concrete. There's a couple of parts of it that I wanted to share about. The first is a keen and alert practitioner. This is the one who sits down right in the center of their life and is willing to look with loving attention at what is. Sometimes what is joy and happiness. And we look at those and we understand how they've come to be and what nurtures them. And sometimes what is fear, is loneliness, is sadness, or is pain. And we look at these and we come to understand how these too have come to be. And also what nurtures and doesn't nurture them. And this is where real insight arises from, not from books, not from listening to someone else like me talking about the Dharma, but doing what is most simple and at the same time what we tend to be most resistant to. Actually turning our attention around and looking deeply at what's arising in each and every moment in our own life, in our own mind, and in our own heart. When we begin to consider the second realization and its focus on desire or thirst, this understanding of the three roots that the Buddha alludes to in this response to Bharadvaja, the root of greed, the mind that's always running after something, objects, people, positions, feelings, and views to give us security. There's the mind state of ill will or aversion, of wanting to avoid or get rid of pain, discomfort, suffering, some people, or a situation, which is, funnily enough, another form of desire. And the root of delusion, or not seeing clearly, which is the fundamental cause of our situation. We don't see clearly that that's our desperate attempt to hold on to things, possessions, people, ideas, and views forever, that contributes to our suffering, since in some way we define ourselves by them. And when we define ourselves by them, it's challenging because the things we grasp onto desperately are always in a state of change from moment to moment. If we've had a real insight into impermanence, then we'll know that even if we try to hold on to something, it's going to change anyway. In fact, it's already changing, despite our best efforts or our desperate attempts. A few years ago, I had a beautiful tea bowl that was gifted to me. I loved it so much. It was the most beautiful piece of pottery. To paraphrase Sir Walter Elliot in Jane Austen's Persuasion, it brought me joy in easeful moments and consolation in difficult ones. One day I was rinsing the tea bowl out, and as I moved my arm to release the water, the bowl slipped from my hand and it arced through the air and it began heading towards the earth. In that moment, in my mind, I experienced a flash of sadness, and I even reached for the bowl to try to catch it, but it hit the ground and it shattered into so many pieces. I sat with it for a while, and then I realized that in a way, from the very beginning, the bowl was already broken. This means that it had a period of time in which it manifested. The causes and conditions, the clay, the artisan, all the different causes and conditions came together so that it was able to manifest in the form of a bowl. But its appearance in the form of a bowl was only a temporary thing. Now, even though the form had changed and the bowl had become dozens of shards, it hadn't become nothing. The bowl was still there, just in a different form, or in many different forms. It was embarking on the next part of its journey. Of course, I felt some sadness, but realizing the sadness that I had, and also looking deeply into the bowl as it was, I saw that I was caught in the idea of all those causes and conditions only having one manifestation, the manifestation of a bowl. And to understand that the bowl was continuing on its journey didn't mean that I didn't treasure it for what it was. To understand impermanence doesn't mean that we don't treasure or enjoy something, that we somehow become joyless beings. In fact, understanding impermanence means that we see that it's never the same from moment to moment, and therefore something is even more precious. When we enter deeply into our own embodied experience, we see that an in-breath, for example, is changing from moment to moment. A while back in the Compassionate Ocean Sangha, we did a meditation exercise in which we experienced the impermanence of the in-breath and the impermanence of the out-breath from moment to moment. And we recognized that the moment in between an in-breath and an out-breath, in which an in-breath becomes an out-breath, is so subtle that it's almost imperceptible. At an imperceptible moment, the in-breath becomes an out-breath, and an out-breath becomes an in-breath, fast or slow. Nothing's the same from moment to moment, even or especially the thing that you call you. To understand deeply that counterintuitively, our real security, actually our only security, comes from releasing. And understand here that releasing doesn't mean throwing something away necessarily, since everything has its value. It means understanding how we tend to define ourselves or our happiness by something. And that the things we tend to define ourselves by, whether they're physical objects, whether they're people, perceptions, or our old favorite, views, they can't give us the security that we're desperate for, since they're never the same from moment to moment. But it would be a shame just to stop there. We need to actually apply that understanding to our lives and release our death grip on the things that we tend to hide behind, since many of us can intellectually grasp this point, but we all have challenges to apply this insight, and this is actually a lifetime's work. It's not necessarily easy, it's actually very subtle. Let's enjoy a sound of the bell. I should probably share right now that it's not necessarily to go and run and throw away everything in your house. That's only the superficial level. Sometimes people write to me and they tell me that they want to simplify their life. They're asking for some suggestions. And I think that they somehow think that I'm going to tell them to throw away all of their stuff. It's good to have less stuff, sure. But it's more important to let go of our views and positions. It actually doesn't mean much releasing external things if these tendencies are still strong in our mind and our heart. So please look inside first, and then look in the middle, and then look in the end. Otherwise, it would be like the octopus in the cartoon that decides to practice letting go and releases one tentacle and says, "I'm doing it," but simultaneously holds on even tighter with the other 7 tentacles. So this week, this month, we're going to be exploring together some aspects of the second realization in the 8 realizations of great beings. And so I'd like to read our teacher Tay's translation of the second realization. Our teacher's translation goes, "The second realization is the awareness that more desire brings more suffering. All hardships in daily life arise from greed and desire. Those with little desire and ambition are able to relax, their bodies and minds free from entanglement." When I was a young monk and I heard this realization, particularly the line about little desire and ambition and relaxing, I would often think about a scene in an old Australian movie where there are 2 men sitting on the front porch chatting away. And then when the morning sun goes up over the roof and they're sitting in shadow, one man turns to the other and says, "Well, it's probably time for us to make a move." The first man agrees, and they stand up and they step into the house. And as the movie continues, they walk through the house, and then they go out the back door and they sit on the back porch and they continue their conversation. This is not exactly what we're talking about here with the energy of relaxation. In the first talk in this series, I mentioned that the Buddha invited us to meditate and to reflect on these realizations. In this realization, we read the line, "All hardships in daily life arise from greed and desire." This is quite a line to reflect on. It's a really strong line to hold in our consciousness, and we'll come back to it later in this talk. The Buddha reminds us that the basis which liberating insight is built on is understanding the nature of our tendency towards repeated patterns of dissatisfaction and suffering, the same thing over and over again, and that desire, thirst, or craving is the fuel that feeds that pain, and that in some cases we're actually addicted to our pain and we mistake it for freedom. In the second of the 4 Noble Truths, which this realization invites us to contemplate, we hear the phrase, "The cause of suffering is craving." There's a lifetime's journey of discovery in this, and it'd be a pity if we just read it and committed it to memory, but never looked a little bit more deeply into the ways in which this tendency manifests in us, and the ways in which it contributes to our cycles of suffering, internal and external. In Buddhist psychology, there are 2 important terms, the universal and the particular. There are many ways to understand these, but I'd like to share how they can help us apply these deep and profound teachings to our own situation. Otherwise, something like desire or craving or suffering or even the 4 Noble Truths can remain only as concepts, things that we recite like a mantra. The Buddha didn't want to offer us more concepts or views. Buddhism's not about creating more views, but rather a practice of recognizing and releasing all views. Please always remember that the Buddha's intention was to give us concrete tools in order to help us to transform our situation. In Plum Village, our teacher Tay always used to share with us that with 1 hour of study needs to go, we need to have 1 hour of study together with 7 hours of actually putting whatever we've learned into practice. So this was a skillful way to remind us of what he always shared with us, that whenever we came into contact with a teaching in whatever sutra or commentary, whatever Dharma book we might be reading or Dharma talk we were listening to, we need to ask ourselves, how can I apply this teaching in my own life in order to transform my situation? Otherwise, it's not very useful, it's not very helpful. In the second noble truth, there are two very big words that have become almost like a dogma for many of us: suffering and craving. There is a universal aspect and a particular aspect to each of these words, and it's important to recognize both. If we look with the universal lens, then we recognize that suffering is a condition that we all share. And at the same time, the way that this suffering or dissatisfaction manifests is quite unique for each one of us. It's the same for craving. Rather than just reciting suffering, suffering, or craving, craving, which can be just a notion, it's much more concrete to begin by reflecting on how does suffering or how does craving manifest in me? What's my suffering? And what are my repeated patterns of suffering? By reflecting on this, and not only passively reflecting on it, but in each and every moment when a feeling arises, a perception arises, some judgment arises, to recognize it and apply this lens of reflection, we gradually come to understand our personal situation. If we reflect in this way on another person's situation or the situation of our nature or the world, then an understanding is possible. If we see suffering for what it is, then we have the possibility to understand what brought it about, the causes and conditions that nurtured it. And if we understand those, then a way out becomes possible. Suffering is one translation of the Pali word dukkha. By the way, I personally wish we would stop translating dukkha only as suffering. It means something closer to ultimately unsatisfactory. Something that might give a momentary pleasure, but ultimately will be unsatisfactory. It might be a good idea to spend a few moments to understand some of the roots of this word dukkha. Sukha, of course, is happiness and bliss, and dukkha, it could be said, is kind of like the opposite of that. As I shared just a moment ago, ultimately unsatisfactory, suffering, painful, disappointing, and so on. People here in Australia have interesting ways to pronounce things, and sometimes they pronounce this word as daka. Daka is a spice and a nut blend that originated from our friends in the Middle East, and it's very popular here in Australia. Many families have got their own special blend of daka. They can be closely guarded secret recipes. Now, while the second noble truth in this way, of course, includes daka, daka is not its main focus. The focus is dukkha. I should probably share that in the same way that many families have their own secret blend of daka, individuals and families also have their own personal blends of dukkha. So as we've shared, dukkha can be translated in many ways. I've seen suffering, unease, dissatisfaction, stress, incapable of satisfying or painful. And it basically refers to our fundamental tendency to expect happiness from internal and external things which are impermanent and can therefore only ever, at best, give us momentary tastes. We get what we want or we think we need, and we're satisfied for just a moment. And then after a short time, we're right back where we started again. So concretely, what is dukkha according to the text? I find myself that there's a very helpful and concise guide to contemplating dukkha. I find it a very helpful text to use to contemplate my own experience. And it's contained in the Buddha's very first recorded teaching. The Buddha says, "Now this, friends, is the noble truth of dukkha. Birth is dukkha. Aging is dukkha. Death is dukkha. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha. Association with the unpleasant is dukkha. Separation from the loved is dukkha. Not getting what is wanted is dukkha. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are dukkha." I'd like to mention something here, something that I feel is important. In Buddhism, suffering or dukkha is not something to be gotten rid of in the sense of trying to throw it away or distance ourselves from it. But rather, as we discovered in our explorations last year on the Four Noble Truths, suffering is to be understood. Dukkha is to be understood. This is the fundamental basis of the Buddha's path. This understanding is built on the foundation of recognizing that there's nothing inherently wrong with pain or discomfort or dissatisfaction. It's as much a part of the way things are as happiness is. Wisdom and compassion begin to manifest when we're able to look deeply into our own suffering. This is, of course, a lifetime process and not something that occurs overnight. I really wish that we would move away from using words like positive or negative to describe our feelings, our emotions, or our experiences. Suffering is bad, and so on. All of the feelings and emotions that we have are natural parts of our human experience and not necessarily inherently good or bad. The original word in Pali that's often translated as positive is kusala, which actually has a meaning closer to skillful. And the word that we often see translated as negative, akusala, in its original sense is closer to meaning not yet skillful. I personally find skillful and not yet skillful to be much more helpful in looking at the behaviors, emotions, mind frames, and tendencies that arise. Whether emotions are positive or negative depends on how we work with them. The same is true with views or feelings, and so on. Our practice is to bring clear awareness to look at our experience. And if we do so, then we might discover as we explore the roots of anger, for example, that it's a great teacher. There's much to discover. And in fact, if we take care of it well, look deeply into it, then there can be an element of skillfulness that arises. When this awareness begins to surface, we run away from pain less, and we run less after some ideal of happiness that always seems to be somewhere just out of our grasp. We begin to experience our heart is big enough to embrace both and see that in some strange way they contain each other. As much as it's our human tendency, it's only when we struggle against pain, against discomfort, against confusion, that these things become suffering. Let's enjoy a sound of the bell. Suffering, it seems to me, is what emerges when we're stuck in the pattern, the repetitive pattern that our teacher Tay calls the second arrow. There's the story of a person who's stabbed by an arrow. It's already very painful, but let's imagine that that person is stabbed by a second arrow in exactly the same place. The pain in that instance is not double, but it's 100 times more painful. There's the experience. And then there's the story we tell ourselves about the experience, the interpretation we make, or as I like to call it, the what ifs rather than the what is. As meditators, we diligently practice to recognize the difference between these two, the what ifs and the what is. And we cultivate the capacity to stay with what is rather than the what ifs. When people begin to cultivate mindfulness, often they're quite surprised to discover that almost all of the thoughts and perceptions that have arisen in them are the what ifs, or as we call in the technical term, wrong perceptions. When we practice to recognize the difference between pain and suffering, while pain might still be there, suffering is lessened. In this human realm, in this samsara realm, pain is mandatory. Discomfort is mandatory. Suffering is somewhat optional. So to understand the second arrow in your own life, take a look at the stories you tell yourselves about the experiences that you have. See if you can differentiate them from the bare experience. How does it feel when you smile to the story and thank it for being there? But ask yourself if you're sure it's the truth. The third Zen ancestor, Sungzan, in his wonderful poem, Faith in Mind, the Xinxingming, he wrote, "The great way is not difficult, if only we don't pick and choose." So what an invitation into a radical openness to our life right now, and to ourselves just as we are, and to not seeking to manipulate it, of not getting caught in pairs of opposites, of picking and choosing happiness over suffering, the ultimate over the relative, or this over that, of understanding that they both contain each other in a way. And continuing to explore that pithy summary of dukkha in the Buddha's first teaching, one of the Buddha's chief disciples, Shariputra, elaborated further. And I'll share a few aspects of what Shariputra shared, since as meditators, we want to understand happiness and suffering. And using these points that Shariputra has shared as meditation topics, I find very helpful. So I invite you to use these in your own meditation practice and in your daily life, to recognize the different forms of dukkha that arise. So Shariputra says, "And what is birth? Whatever coming to be, coming forth, appearance of aggregates, and acquisition of sense experiences and reactions to those of living beings, that is called birth." So sometimes we have a very limited view of what birth is. We think of physical birth. But here Shariputra shares with us a deeper and broader understanding of birth. In an earlier series of talks, we've spoken about the fact that birth, or in Pali jati, doesn't only refer to physical birth, but to moment by moment arising and passing away of everything that is, of our breath, of mental formations, of consciousness, of feelings, of sensations, of the cells in our body, of ideas, and so on. So this is this understanding of birth can be very helpful, particularly if we take the example, let's take the example of a sensation. We observe a sensation and we notice how it comes to be and how it's there and it changes over a period of time, and then eventually it disappears or it moves into something else. And then Sariputra continues, and what is aging? Whatever aging, decrepitude, brokenness, graying, wrinkling, decline of life force, weakening of the faculties of the various beings in this or that group is called aging. And what is death? Whatever deceasing, passing away, breaking up, disappearance, dying, death, completion of time, breakup of the aggregates, casting off of the body, interruption in the life faculty of the various beings in this or that group, that's called death. And what is pain? Whatever is experienced as bodily pain, bodily discomfort, pain or discomfort born of bodily contact, that's called pain. And what's distress? Whatever is experienced as mental pain, mental discomfort, pain or discomfort born of mental contact, that's called distress. And what is despair? Whatever despair, despondency, desperation of anyone suffering from misfortune, touched by a painful thing, that's called despair. And what is association with the unpleasant? There's the case where undesirable, unpleasing, unattractive sights, sounds, aromas, flavors, or tactile sensations occur, or one has connection, contact, relation, interaction with those who wish one ill, who wish for your harm, who wish for your discomfort. That is the suffering of association with the unbeloved. And what's separation from the loved? There's the case where pleasant, attractive sights, sounds, aromas, flavors, or tactile sensations do not occur to one, or one has no connection, no contact, no relationship, no interaction with those who wish one well, who wish for one's benefit, who wish for your comfort. This is called the dukkha of separation from the loved. And what is the dukkha of not getting what is wanted? In beings who are subject to birth and death, the wish arises, may we not be subject to death, and may death not come to us. But this is not achieved by wanting alone. This is the pain of not getting what's wanted. Or with the same mindset, we bring the same frame of reference to aging, to birth, to illness, to death, to sorrow, to distress and despair. And the wish arises that we may not experience these things. And this is the dukkha of not getting what is wanted. So we can use the above as a concrete contemplation to understand our situation. Sometimes people say that Buddhism is pessimistic because of the awareness of dukkha. I would say that Buddhism is optimistic because the Buddha said that each and every one of us, and by that he meant you, can transform your situation through generating the insight of the Four Noble Truths for yourself in your own life. This is a very practical and concrete practice. Dukkha, your suffering, not just a general idea of suffering, but clearly directing our attention to whenever we experience something in the categories mentioned above. To realize that suffering is to be understood, and that the root of that suffering, when we come to understand where that sufferings come from, that it's to be understood and released. And then we have the realization that it's possible to transform this suffering. And when we understand that it's possible to transform the suffering, we understand the causes and conditions from where that suffering arose. We understand what nurtured it. Then we understand what doesn't nurture it any longer, and a way out becomes possible. the path of transforming our suffering becomes something possible. I'd like to invite all of my friends, if we're meditators, if we really are dedicated to this path, if we're good students of our teacher Tai, then I'd really like to invite everyone to make a commitment to ourselves and to each other, to stop moaning and complaining about suffering, about discomfort. It's part of the way things are in this samsaric round. And if we really take on board the concrete and empowering practice of the Four Noble Truths, then within the context of the first Noble Truth, suffering is to be fully understood. And as mindfulness practitioners, we have the capacity to be able to understand it. And it's actually where our insight, our wisdom, our compassion, if we take care of it well, comes from. If we handle it well in this way, our suffering, our discomfort becomes a great teacher. The noble truth of dukkha, incapable of satisfying, painful, and so on, is the basic insight that we expect happiness from states or things which are impermanent and can only ever at best give us momentary taste. So as a solid practitioner, rather than trying to push discomfort, even if it's very slight, which is our tendency, pushing it away, let's practice to look deeply and to understand each situation of our life from within as honestly and thoroughly as possible. In Buddhism, happiness and joy come about when we develop the capacity to let go and to leave behind in each and every moment. And one of the deepest letting goes is to let go of our agendas. One word that we hear a lot in Buddhism is businessless. In fact, it's seen in some way to be the ultimate aim of the practice. What does it mean to cultivate the capacity of having nothing to do anymore? There are many layers to this. But on one level, it means to become aware of all of our hidden agendas. I want to get rid of this painful thought, this painful feeling, this painful sensation or person, or I want more of this pleasant sensation, thought, feeling, or person, and so on. I want more of this. I want less of that. Want. If we're not careful, it can become a massive energetic thread in our practice. And many times, the thing that we want more of is actually our habit energies, our entrenchments, the things that actually are ultimately part of our round of samsara, our round of dukkha. This is the shadow side, the often subtle difference between want and aspiration is one that's incredibly helpful to pay attention to. Craving or desire is a translation of the Pali word tanha, which literally means thirst. Concretely, there are three aspects of desire which we can view as three threads that wind together to form a rope. The first form of desire is called kama tanha, the thirst for sense pleasures, which is the search for happiness through sense pleasures, a pleasant sound, a sensation, a taste, and so on. We got a tendency to think that more will increase our happiness. So if we have a pleasant taste, for example, initially we want more, or a pleasant sound, we want more, or a pleasant smell, we want more. We get drawn into it and we want more. But if we apply mindfulness to this process, we'll notice that even if we step into it and want more of that pleasant fragrance, that pleasant taste, that pleasant sensation, that pleasant sound, that dukkha will arise. This sense of unsatisfactoriness will arise at some point, because the pleasure diminishes. If we're chasing after something, then the pleasure will diminish at some point. The second strand of desire is called bhavatana. This is the desire to become. In simple terms, this is the drive to become something, anything really, other than what we are right now, and it can be very subtle. For example, if we paid attention to the way this desire becomes manifest, we can notice that aspects of bhavatana, the desire to become, can also manifest in our meditation practice. For example, I want to practice meditation so that I can become happy, or become peaceful, become liberated, and so on, with the emphasis on become. There's this sense of lack, this idea that we can't touch those things right now when we have this framework of vibhavatana. And at the other extreme of this becoming energy, the third strand of craving is the desire for non-existence of something, vibhavatana, the desire to extinguish or get rid of things. I want to get rid of my suffering. I want to get rid of my depression. I want to get rid of jealousy, fear, anxiety, the other person, and so on. I should probably mention that we shouldn't make the mistake of trying to get rid of vibhavatana. That would be a bit of a rookie mistake. We don't want to create an internal war against this tendency. But at the same time, we don't want to keep feeding it endlessly also. If we have looked deeply, we might notice that these last two forms of desire or thirst or craving, becoming and extinguishing, they're very much connected. And they're also based on the idea of opposites. For example, I want to get rid of my anger so that I can become peaceful. And we might notice, if we take this lens of reflecting on how desire or craving manifests in us, we might notice that we have many of those in our own experience. I want to get rid of something in order to get something else, or vice versa. I want to get something so that I can get rid of something else. One of the most important realizations we can have is to understand our tendency to think that we always need one more thing, one more condition, in order to finally arrive, to get there, wherever there is for us. Another line in the second realization that I'd like to speak about is the line, excessive desire brings more suffering, or more desire brings more suffering. As I mentioned earlier, this is a direct reference to the second noble truth. I'd like to direct everyone's attention to one important word in the above sentence. That's the word excessive. The Buddha didn't ask us to get rid of all desire, even if that was something that is possible. He asked us to notice what we're looking for and to recognize our multifaceted motivations and tendencies and consider whether they're in alignment with our deepest aspiration. Let's imagine for a moment that our deepest aspiration is to be able to transform our suffering so that we can help others. That would be what we would consider to be a skillful wish, a skillful motivation, a skillful aspiration. If our motivations in each and every moment are in alignment with our deep aspiration, for example, the aspiration to transform suffering to help others, then they're considered to be skillful. And if they're not, they tend to be unskillful. In Buddhist psychology, motivation, the energy that moves us forward, is considered to have many aspects and can be very subtle. We might have our deepest motivation, and in each and every other moment, other intentions might also co-arise to check in with ourselves, to identify and to clarify our motivations throughout the day is a really important practice. Is our motivation a wish to connect with others, a compassionate intention, an intention to love, to let go, an intention to practice meditation, or a desire to forgive? All of these would be described as wholesome. Or maybe we notice an intention to close down our heart, to hold on to something, a view, a position, and so on, or a feeling, or to get something for ourselves. Earlier, we touched on the universal factor and the particular. For example, suffering in general is universal. And then there's my suffering, the way that suffering manifests in me. That's the particular. Desire as a universal is indeterminate in that it can be skillful or unskillful. Desire moves into the unskillful realm and becomes craving when it contains within itself an element of lack. When somehow we have the mind frame that we're not good enough, or that we need something or someone in order to feel fulfilled. Or maybe we think that we need to become something that we're not. Our teacher Tay offers us a beautiful and powerful mantra in this moment. You are enough. You have enough. One of the hallmarks of the Buddha's teaching is the middle way between extremes, between pairs of opposites. So notice that this realization doesn't say that all desire is bad, but rather invites us to consider the nature of the desires and wishes that arise within us and how they relate to our aspiration and what the differences are between appropriate and inappropriate desire. This is where I believe the Buddha's teaching is truly radical, because the Buddha basically tells us you don't need one more thing. You already are what you want to become. Our practice is the practice of uncovering what's been there all along. To put it another way, the approach of Buddhist practice is to uncover the innate wholeness that's always been there within us and is the natural state of our mind. And this is actually quite challenging for many of us, since we might have grown up with a sense that we're broken, that we're not good enough, and that we need to be fixed. And this might even be one of the main threads in our meditation practice. You are enough. Volition, motivation, intention gives shape to our practice, and it creates the ground from which insight blossoms. The nature of our motivation, the nature of our volition will determine the nature of our insight. There's another strong line in this second realization. It's the line, all hardships in daily life arise from greed and desire. This is a really strong line from the Buddha. The Buddha's inviting us to use the lens of greed and desire to consider the root of all the difficulty and suffering that we experience individually and collectively. When we begin to look in this way, we begin to see that suffering, both individual and collective, is systemic. We begin to see things from a systems point of view. And using the lens of this realization, thirst or desire, we can bring to mind a difficulty, a challenge, or even some aspect of dukkha in our own life, or the life of our family, our community, or our nation. And we can consider some of the ways or aspects in which greed or desire, or its seeming opposite, aversion, which is, as we shared earlier, in some way also an aspect of desire, how they've contributed to creating this situation. The nature of desire is that in some way, unskillful desire can't be completely fulfilled, will always want more. It's a little like drinking salt water to soothe our thirst. In the second realization, we also read the phrase, the cycle of birth and death. And the Buddha's insight is that there's a continuous cycle of birth and death occurring within and around us in every moment, that's born from this tendency of desire, of running towards something on the one hand and pushing other things away, aversion on the other. The cause of this round is our excessive desire for what we mistakenly think that we lack. It's a little bit like being in a hamster wheel that we're all trapped in, and mostly, honestly, we don't really want to be liberated from it because we've gotten habituated to the hamster wheel. We shouldn't underestimate the power of the familiar. In the last series of talks that we had a chance to explore together, we discovered that the Buddha shared in some of the most ancient teachings that are recorded in the Pali Canon, in the Book of Eights, that often we mistake our own entrenchments for liberation. Not so long ago, I was sitting with one of my mentees, and we were contemplating various aspects of this cycle within our own lives. And at one point in the consultation, he turned to me and he said, "Teifapai, to be really honest, there's a part of me that's afraid, that's really afraid to let go of this cycle." And that was a really deep insight. And I honestly feel that this is the situation that most of us are in. It takes courage to recognize the cycles of samsara, the repeated patterns of dissatisfaction that occur within our own lives, and to be willing to let them go. Do we really want to be liberated? Have we considered what liberation might actually look like? Are we willing to recognize and to let go of all of our comfortable entrenchments? And all of us have them. Many of us have built up quite high walls or deep trenches, whichever metaphor you find useful, of concepts, of ideas, of habit energies, or behaviors to protect ourselves from being challenged or touched. And despite our very best efforts of avoidance, life as it is, death, dissatisfaction, old age, sickness, sorrow, and separation is going to touch us all sooner or later. It's at that moment that some of us build these walls even higher, the walls of views or behaviors and so on. But if we're lucky, rather than seeing these experiences as something wrong, we realize that they're actually noble messengers that can call us forth, to call us forth from our hiding places, and to invite us on a journey of discovery. Not only once, but many times over, the Buddha invites us to see old age, sickness, and so on, not only as natural parts of our lives, but as great teachers. Perhaps the greatest teachers of all. With mindfulness and hopefully a sense of humor, gradually we recognize our inner and outer grasping and the ways in which we mistake this grasping for liberation. And in this way, we begin to see the tangle that we're in. So I want to share also, in addition to repeated patterns of dissatisfaction, we also have patterns of joy, of peace, of forgiveness, of healing. And it's our intention as practitioners to strengthen those beneficial and helpful patterns. This endless round of samsara that is touched on in the second realization can be understood on many levels, and it doesn't only refer to physical birth and death. In each and every moment, we're being born and we're dying. Cells and tissues, thoughts and ideas, inspirations, feelings, and so on are being born and passing away. And if we haven't cultivated this capacity of mindfulness and shone the light of mindfulness on our patterns, we continue to repeat them over and over, not quite wising up to the fact that the very cause of our repeated dissatisfaction, our dukkha, our suffering, is not outside our own mind. One key to transforming this craving, this thirst for something that we think is outside of ourselves, is cultivating this understanding, as we shared earlier, that in a deep way, we're already what we want to become. And that our habit energies and familiar hiding places are only false protection. At that moment, a beautiful quality emerges, disenchantment. It's a disenchantment with all of our old strategies. And along with that disenchantment, this understanding that we've been down this road so many times before, it's not going to be different this time. There's another quality that emerges, and that's a willingness to step into the unknown, starting with the very basic, and then moving to the deeper aspects of our being. There, without too much effort on our part, there's a reorientation of our focus. It's a very beautiful process to observe within ourselves, within our experience. Recognizing and transforming this cycle of samsara is not a one-time event. It's an ever-unfolding journey of discovery. There's always something more to discover. So dear friends, I hope that you have found something helpful and useful and something that you can put into practice in your own practice life from our exploration of the second realization. It's been a joy to sit together with each of you. We'll come to a close with a sound of the bell.